Hello and welcome to another edition of Sport Unlocked, the podcast trying to make sense of how sport is run and what the big decisions mean. I'm Rob Harris, and alongside me, again from the Sports News Beat, are Martin Ziegler and Tariq Panja. This week's talking points: the collapse in transfer window spending, TV rights turmoil in the French League, and a leverage American takeover of Burnley creating new concerns. Plus, the Panorama boxing investigation and sex bans at the Olympics. We'll also have a guest this week.
I'm Laura McAllister and I'm standing for the FIFA Council.
But first, regular listeners might notice some recurring issues coming up on the show. So we're going to try to highlight what's new as quickly as possible. So Ziegs, what is the latest we discovered on the newly expanded Champions League format this week?
Yeah, Rob, I think the new thing we've learned is UEFA has now thrown its weight behind having 36 teams with the Swiss model, which we've discussed before. So that's 4 extra teams, but I think the controversial element is how those 4 extra teams are going to be chosen. And what has emerged this week is that there will be a safety net for the top clubs. 2 of those positions will be given to the clubs in Europe with the highest UEFA coefficient, who haven't qualified via the domestic league. So what it means is if Manchester United, Liverpool, Juventus, for example, if they for some reason finish 5th or 6th, they would still get into the Champions League, which you can see is something the Glazers, for example, would absolutely be delighted with, because it costs them so much money, and it's a real financial blow every time they don't get into the Champions League.
And the one thing we're more certain of now is the fact that there will be 10 group stage games rather than the 6, and the top 8 teams will automatically qualify for the last 16. Then the next 16 teams will contest a playoff to make the last 16. It's complicated, but basically we're going to get a lot more European football and a lot more games to squeeze into the existing calendar. Yeah,
I mean, to me, this looks like UEFA and the European Clubs Association have come together and agreed a deal to fend off the Super League, because this way you have more money, you have guaranteed participation, probably for the top clubs. And actually, it's quite. I like the model. I think it's going to be really interesting. But what it does do is means they get probably around 100 extra European matches a season. And in terms of the broadcast potential, that could be really important for UEFA, and actually it could have a negative effect on domestic competitions.
The clubs will certainly be hoping the newly expanded Champions League generates more income for them, particularly after we've just seen the huge drop in financial firepower of the clubs in the winter transfer window. It closed on Monday with transfer spending in the Premier League dropping from £230 million last year to just £70 million this year. So is this all due to the pandemic and the ongoing financial struggles with stadiums being closed to fans and all that revenue on match days completely being cut off?
Yeah, I don't think it was actually. I think obviously that was a massive factor, but also Brexit has been a really a big cause of the drop. The number of permanent signings it's less than it's single figures, which is incredible, really. And if you look at the 3 biggest deals, 2 of them were fees agreed in the last transfer window. So it's very much a sign of the times. But yeah, the fact you can't go, the smaller Premier League clubs can't go to the continent and sign up somebody for who's not a seasoned international, who's not a top player, and just bring them in as a make weight. That can no longer happen now. So inevitably, the number of signings is going to drop.
Looking broader into Europe, you look at Italy, Spain, Germany as well. These are leagues that have essentially been seized up like the Premier League because of the fact the stadiums have been shut a lot longer than any of them anticipated. Revenues continue to decline, and for longer than they had originally anticipated. Added to the fact that a lot of these teams, the smaller middle-sized ones, expect to sell their players to the Premier League. So when England sneezes, the rest of Europe catches a cold. And that's the analogy that probably fits in with the transfer market right now. The rest of Europe is waiting for English spending, and there just isn't any. And that's the reality for the next window as well, probably. I spoke to some club executives. They were hoping to sell to the Premier League this summer and this winter just to stay afloat. I think we're going to talk about it later. But France, for example, top league in second division, they've got no idea what the future of their television income is. So there's some real problems on the continent. And if English clubs aren't buying, which is the motor of the football transfer economy, we're going to see some huge problems ahead.
Well, the Inter Milan chief executive certainly hopes so. Giuseppe Moratti, he thinks the old model is unsustainable, and he says we're going to see an end to the big transfer fees and salaries. Do we really think that's the case? FIFPro's certainly been trying for so long to see an end to the large transfer fees, but you get the sense that once the money comes flowing back in from fans, those clubs in an advantageous position will be able to go back in with those big deals and heavy spending. It wasn't like the global financial crisis of a dozen years ago brought an end to the wage inflation and the spiralling transfer fees.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's going to be a bit of time before we see the sort of PSG type spending when they got Neymar and Mbappe for whatever it was, £220 million in a single transfer window on two players. Surely that we can't see that for a few years now, because I mean, PSG have this problem with the French TV rights that we're going to talk about shortly, and also I think generally most clubs are going to think they don't want to spend that sort of money at the moment when there's such uncertainty. So I think he's right to an extent that there is going to be deflation. But for how long is the big question?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think there's going to be a bit of a market correction. We already saw before the pandemic, the TV rights market generally flatten, and that was without the pandemic. Now we're going to have the kind of impact on the economy, the wider economy. And we've also seen clubs that are in financial trouble, big clubs as well. You look at their balance sheets, they're going to have to fix them before they start spending again. Barcelona had that enormous loss. Juventus had the enormous loss. So you're going to have to kind of fix your current situation before you go on a splurge. And whether we see a splurge will depend on a couple of factors. One, which is the main one, which is the TV market. If that comes roaring back, then you start spending again, and the fans coming back within that. And then the other big uncertainty, we've discussed in the last two editions of this, is what the future of football looks like. Are there going to be these super leagues? Are there going to be a kind of a more elite Champions League with more money going to the biggest teams? And will that generate the spending? I think it's a bit of to be seen.
Yeah, particularly telling, obviously, that Barcelona, despite struggling so much this season, haven't been able to just jump into the transfer window in a way that they might have wanted to, and the fact they've had to offload players as well in recent months to sort of trim that wage bill. And we've seen that's why they're obviously trying to push for the Super League as well. And it's a Spanish broadcaster causing all sorts of turmoil for the French league after their rights deal with MediaPro collapsed. At the start of the week, they tried to secure a new broadcast partner. They did get offers from the American companies Amazon, Discovery and DAZN to show matches from the top two divisions, but the bids fell below the minimum requirements, and it left the French league scrambling to strike a new deal, which eventually they did do on Thursday with Canal+, who will pay €200 million for the rights until the rest of the season. But it really seems to show that Liga are in a real mess when it comes to broadcast rights and trying to get value.
Absolutely. I think it's been an absolute car crash from start to finish. These rights, we have to remember, it's an emergency sale in the middle of a season, because the big deal that league was crowing about crumbled immediately. This was the so-called €1 billion contract with MediaPro, the Spanish company. That was pretty much dead on arrival. They ended up in some sort of arbitration process and only managed to eke out €100 million from MediaPro, and who owned 80%. The other 20% of those rights were owned by beIN, which immediately sold them onto Canal+, which is essentially the football brand in France, which, like the equivalent of Sky Sports, say, they have motored and powered the French Football League since the 90s, and that 20% cost 330 million euros. So Canal Plus said, hang on guys, if you're going to re-auction the 80% we don't have, which is bound to be worth a lot less, you have to take this back as well, because we could be holding 20% at 330 million and you end up selling 80% for even less than that. Something wrong here. And then we entered this auction process that yielded a fine headline that you have international broadcasters bidding, but no one willing to spend enough money to even meet your reserve price. Meanwhile, Canal, beIN, Altice, the big bidders for French football in the past, just couldn't be bothered. This is a real mess.
And it does create so much uncertainty for the French league going forward. They had been hoping to be generating €1 billion a year from their rights. One person who's pretty brutal about the whole saga was the former France manager, Roman Domenech, who's now at Nantes. And a reporter from MediaPro asked him whether he regretted coming out of retirement given some of the results. And Domenech replied, I can ask you the same question. Do you regret leaving L'Equipe of MediaPro?
That's quite a good.
Harsh, that.
Yeah.
Go on.
An accident de voiture, I think it's called, is it? Is that right? You speak French fluently, Tarek? An accident de voiture?
Sounds about right, Zeeks. Car crash.
Is that right? Accident de car crash. I was looking at the how much Channel 4 paid for the TV rights for the cricket. I mean, it's like incredibly low. It's something like £5 million for 4 Test matches. When you think what the Sky and BT, when they did their deal for the Premier League rights, they were paying an average of £9 million per match. So, I obviously, cricket is not as valuable as Premier League matches, but on the other hand, I think we are seeing signs that the broadcasters everywhere are not going to be prepared to pay as much for sports rights as they have done in the past.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mambo number 5.
That's the unmistakable sounds of cricket returning to terrestrial TV, isn't it? As we talked about last week, Channel 4 have succeeded in getting the rights for the India v England Test series. And I think it illustrates how Sky and BT Sport, who are also offered the rights, are sort of keeping their powder dry, probably because they need to save up, probably count their pennies, ready to launch bids for the Premier League TV rights when they come up shortly. And I think both companies are sort of been tightening their belts, and what it has meant is that for a lot of people who last watched Channel 4's coverage of the Ashes in 2005 and are unwilling to pay for a sports subscription, they'll now have access to cricket. And that, in some ways, has got to be a good thing.
And what could also look and sound good is the return of fans. And that could happen by the time of the second test in Chennai. Something to watch out for. Well, across Asia, preparations are underway for the Olympics in Japan, something we've talked about on previous shows. And we've had some new developments from Tokyo this week with the first of the playbooks. Now, these are the rules that set out just how participants in the Olympics will have to conduct themselves during the pandemic. And there's been all sorts of things like having to list all your close contacts when you arrive in Tokyo, not going to any shops, bars or restaurants. And when in stadiums, no cheering or singing, just clapping. Now, there has been a lot of intrigue over the regulations that are set to be in place in the Olympic Village because everyone's been told to avoid close contact, close physical contact, and that's being viewed as a sex ban.
Yeah, that was the angle I certainly took from the playbook and wrote about. I got a few sort of responses from people based in Tokyo that I was perhaps focusing on the more lurid aspects of it, but I think it's quite a big issue actually, because if you look at what previous Olympians have said, actually, the sort of post-games parties, they finish their events, it's a massive thing for all the athletes. You have hundreds of thousands of condoms distributed at the previous games. I think it was something like 400,000 in Rio, which is just, considering there's only 10,000 athletes, that's quite a lot. My colleague on the Times, Matthew Syed, has written before, but when he was competing as a table tennis player, he said the Olympics were a sex fest, I think he described it. So the fact that all this sort of thing isn't going to be happening is, unfortunately for the athletes, is going to be I hesitate to use the word blow, but it is. Yeah, it's not going to be happening for them this time.
Yeah, it's not going to be a barrel of laughs at all, is it? And back to the point Ziegs was making. I think the swimmers, their events end up being front loaded, and they're notorious for partying in the games, disrupting the athletes' village. There's been a few complaints from their competitors whose events take place after those. So maybe some of those performers will be relieved. But yeah, it's going to be a real sterile atmosphere, and it just seems like they just have to get this thing done. And part of this playbook as well seems to suggest it's a in and out, closely guarded, and just please don't ruin our games and move on. From a media perspective as well, it seems like you have to tell the IOC exactly where you're going and who you're seeing and what your movements are going to be like. That seems quite overbearing when you're trying to report freely on this event. As we talked about last week, the media have a role in I guess, finding out what exactly is happening on and off the field of play.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just remembering talking about the swimmers enjoying themselves afterwards, after their events. Do you remember that at their last games when Ryan Lochte, the American swimmer, who him and some other swimmers went out in Rio, got completely tanked up, and then tried to leave a petrol station without paying. And then ended up claiming that they'd been robbed at gunpoint, and then CCTV showed they'd actually made it all up. But they were two shades to the wind. But to go back to what you're saying about having people there at the Olympics to keep an eye on things. I mean, as I said before last week, it's important for this independent scrutiny, and not just So you don't just have the broadcasters covering the games, but you have journalists looking at other things. I mean, some of the most important investigative stories we've had in the last decade have been by Hadjo Sappelt and ARD, the German TV station. Lots of other people contributed to looking really in depth at some of the behind-the-scenes stories there. So clearly that's a really important thing.
And the dangers of investigative journalism are highlighted this week when the BBC reported that its Panorama crew had been threatened after a programme on boxing. It related to the role of Daniel Kinahan in the sport. Now, he was thanked by Tyson Fury last year for setting up a fight with Anthony Joshua. But it's Kinahan's links with organised crime that generated considerable concern. The High Court in Ireland had previously named Kinahan as a senior figure in organised crime as well as in drug trafficking operations. Now, Kinahan does not have any convictions, and he was said to be no longer involved in negotiating fights. But Panorama believes he is still advising fighters, and certainly the Culture Secretary Oliver Dowden told the BBC's Dan Rowan this week that the allegations raised by Panorama were worrying. So can we have any confidence that boxing authorities will look into this with the rigour necessary?
No, I don't think there's any hint of any good governance from the world of boxing at all. It's especially pro boxing. It's about money and putting on fights. However they come about, and that historically has been that way. But this as far as Irish media were concerned, they've been writing about this for at least the last 12 months. Finally, it's now reached a wider audience thanks to the Panorama program. But you only have to see what happened in the program and the reaction as well. In the program, only Barry McGuigan, former featherweight world champion and now a promoter himself, was willing to put his head above the parapet with some really stark comments about what a danger to the sport the development of Daniel Kinahan being such a significant part of it is. He he has lost some fighters, his own, I think about 5, to the Kinahan boxing organisation. And also the reaction from fighters linked to Kinahan who post the show going on air have talked down Barry McGuigan, for example, and talked down the show while promoting the management company. And it looks like the fight setters, the Eddie Hearns, the Barry Hearns, the Bob Arams in the US, will continue working with that group, with the caveat that as far as they're concerned, Daniel Kinahan has nothing to do with it, has stepped aside. But if you were to watch that Panorama program, that appears to be a facade, a convenient facade for all involved, because these big money fights are being promoted and are being put on. Look, we got Fury, AJ coming up in Saudi Arabia, huge money fight, a fight that Daniel Kinahan had a role in. So no one wants to, certainly those people within boxing, no one wants to see that be derailed by this, and they will keep quiet and give mealy-mouthed comments about how this man has no role in boxing.
And Kinahan's lawyers told the BBC that he's exited the business of MTK, the promoters, and the fact that they make clear, has had no criminal convictions. But Martin, what do you think the ongoing questions are over this investigation and Kinahan's links to some of the biggest fights in the world, potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be scrutiny now as to whether on the company, on Kinahan himself. I mean, boxing has had a long history of being associated with the seedier side of life. I mean, do you remember Don King? I think he was sent to prison for stamping somebody to death over non-payment of a gambling debt. So there are, boxing is tied to, unfortunately, to some people who operate beyond the boundaries of the law, and I think it has done for a long time, and it probably will continue to do. But I think the scrutiny is going to get even greater.
Of course, there's always so much scrutiny of the conduct of Tyson Fury, the people he associates with, the controversially offensive views. And he did have that 2-year doping ban imposed. And it gets me thinking back now to one of the times I encountered Tyson Fury, of all places, at Euro 2016 in Nice. I was actually doing some interviews with England fans ahead of the Iceland game about the Brexit vote, which had taken place a couple of days earlier, when suddenly you spot Tyson Fury in an England shirt being mobbed by a load of England fans, and he started to lead them Pied Piper-like into a nearby bar. Now, this was particularly interesting because only a couple of days earlier he said he'd had to postpone his title rematch with Vladimir Klitschko because of an ankle injury. Yep, there he was, enjoying himself. No worries in the world at all going into the bar. We did actually later discover it was around that time he'd learned of the UCAD investigation. Anyway, when he got into the bar, he went and spent €1,000 on Jaeger bombs. Of course, I followed them in and I actually recorded it. So let's take a listen back to that moment.
What does everybody want? Yeah!
Reminiscing about times there in France 5 years ago. Of course, what was also memorable is the England fans chanting about we voted to leave Europe, and then, of course, a few hours later, we were humiliated by Iceland in the Euros. Well, there is good news relating to France over the Six Nations, because the French sports minister this week has said that coronavirus rules will be relaxed, so the French team will be able to play others on home soil and visit other countries in the Six Nations, so that immediate threat has been removed. We do only have a men's Six Nations for now. The women's event has been put on hold until April, but the Six Nations is taking place at a time of renewed investment in there, isn't there, from CVC Capital?
Yeah, I think the French Federation have given the go-ahead 365 million investment. I mean, I think a lot of people are going to think that this means it's going to be the end of the Six Nations on terrestrial TV. They're going to try and get a return on their money by selling it to the likes of Sky or BT. that'll be an interesting development. See what happens with that next year. But yeah, CVC, they seem to be quite active, don't they? Despite the pandemic, they've put a similar amount of money into volleyball, which is I know certainly in the UK is not a particularly big sport, but I know it is in Europe and the USA. Same company close to doing a deal with Serie A for Italian football. So things seem to be happening with them. I think Six Nations starts this weekend, and interesting to see where things go with that in the future for sure.
The CVC are kind of interesting, because they've made a ton of money, packet money, on the back of the Formula One investment, which they ended up selling to Liberty, and that really whet their appetite. And they've been busy talking to everyone. They talked to FIFA about Club World Cups. They've been talking to the Super League guys, I understand. They talk to talk to anyone who's got a sport to sell. But they're not the only ones. There's a lot of private equity money, a lot of cash looking for a home, and they see a lot of desperation and a potential for really good returns in sport. Serie A, you mentioned, had expressions of interest from a number of these finance houses, and that they're all competing with each other to try and get a slice of the action. So this does seem like there's a lot of this capital floating around, looking for a home, looking for a good return that they're not seeing maybe in the markets right now. Look in traditional investments, and sport seems like a place where they think they're going to see potentially double-digit returns, and they seem to be jumping over each other to try and get a deal.
And the latest investment in the Premier League in the last month or so has come at Burnley from ALK Capital, just the latest American owners in the Premier League. Yet there are questions about the debt that has been used to finance the deal, reminiscent of the Glazers at Manchester United in 2005. This comes at a time, it's a big weekend for the Glazers. They've got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers side in the Super Bowl for the first time since 2003, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. But what do we make of this Burnley deal? It's certainly raising a lot of questions over just how they used Michael Dell's financing operation to provide the funding for it.
That questions were raised at the time, and actually David Condit wrote a good piece in The Guardian this week about how the actual takeover was funded, and the fact that they used money that was already in the bank in Burnley's bank account. Effectively, the new owners used that to buy the club, and they've got now got a fair bit of debt that they have to service. So for Burnley fans, it may be a time where they're a little bit concerned of what the future holds for them.
I mean, they seem to be trying to bank on the fact that they'll be able to develop players using some other parts of the AL Capital business with artificial intelligence scouting, and almost using that as a way of generating revenue. But it's so uncertain and unpredictable. Just if you can develop a talent that does bring in either a player that's strong enough to play for the first team, or one you can cash in significantly on, and it's really banking on the fact they stay in the Premier League. And also the value of the Premier League rights holds up, and they can meet these debts. But if you're a Burnley fan, you've got to be, slightly concerned. Obviously, the fact that the sustainability of the club, when it was so well run in terms of even when they went down, they did not overspend to try to get back up again. And you've got a chairman, Alan Pace, who I have spoken to, who's basically questioning why people should be so alarmed by the fact that there's debt when so many people take on debt in other businesses and other walks of life.
Well, one word for him, Portsmouth. But anyway, I think there's more questions than answers still. He's done a lot of media, Mr. Pace. But the questions remain. These are kind of fundamental questions, really. And I've also seen the people who've sold the club referred to as really good stewards of Burnley. Is it Mike Garlick being the main one? But again, the question would be for him as well. If he's a Burnley fan and someone who's led the club so well, there's talk, at least in the media reports, that a lot of the cash for the takeover, cash that went to him and his partners, was essentially cash that was sitting on Burnley's books. So this is the cash that the club generated, cash that could have been used perhaps to build the business, either improve the playing squad or improve the infrastructure at the stadium, which was saved maybe for a rainy day, but essentially has gone to the former owners. And then you talk about the loan, the quantum of interest is said to be enormous. And MSD Capital, Michael Dell's company, which has become a bigger and bigger lender in football, as football clubs become more desperate as well. Southampton, for example, have borrowed at a rate of almost 10%, 9 point something. That is a huge amount of interest to be borrowing at, and it shows there's appetite for new lenders, etc., but only at these eye-watering rates. And Burnley, which had no debt on it, was hardly paying any interest, is now kind of beholden to lenders, owes money left, right and centre only because of a takeover. A takeover that only works if TV rights start going, increasing at a level which we don't anticipate that they will do in the short, medium term. And if they can discover players through this artificial intelligence system, it does smack a little bit of the cleverest people in the room, because we've heard this from owners before, where we've got a proprietary data, etc., that we're going to do, world-class scouting. If there's scores of teams that have invested in data. So what makes Burnley special? I guess we're going to see in the next few months if it's hot air or if it's real.
And the questions won't go away. In fact, they're so vague and they're not sort of talking openly to the fans in particular about just where the financing has come from, that, particularly if results drop off and there are concerns about their Premier League status, that this lack of openness over where the money is coming from and the liabilities will only generate questions over how right the takeover was to take place.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people look at the Glazers and said, look at they did a leveraged buyout of Manchester United and they've made literally hundreds of millions of pounds from it. But that's Manchester United is probably a very special case, and the Glazers still remain incredibly unpopular with the fan base there, don't they? So. Yeah, I mean, obviously they've got other things to think about, haven't they, this week with the Super Bowl coming up for the Buccaneers? But I'm sure that if people try and copy that model, there's no guarantee it's going to work.
Well, I'm delighted to say we've been joined now by a guest and a former captain of the Wales football team, Laura McAllister. Welcome to Sport Unlocked, Laura.
Thank you, my pleasure.
It's a busy few weeks for you. You're campaigning for a seat on the FIFA Council and you're up against the Italian Evelina Cristalin for the UEFA seat that is reserved for a female member. So Laura, how's the campaign going, and just why do you want to join the FIFA Council, where it's not exactly a place where we find many former players?
Well, it's a very vibrant campaign. We decided, obviously, we wanted to stand back in 2016, and we were prohibited from standing because of the British Vice Presidency regulation at that time. But the chief exec of the FAW, Jonathan Ford, with lots of support, by the way, from UEFA, has managed to get that regulation altered. So it means that I'm allowed to stand. And once we were clear that we were going to be able to stand, we wanted to really give it everything we could. As you said, Rob, I'm a former international player. I know the game extremely well because when I retired from playing, I was really keen to put something back into the sport. So I've been involved in governance through the Football Association of Wales, but also broader sports governance through UK Sport, where I sat for 8 years. And I was chair of Sport Wales, which is the government quango that looks after all aspects of sport in Wales. So I was 6 years as chair. So I know the governance of sport inside out. So it seems to me that if I'm going to contribute to football, then I should aim to do it at the highest level. I'm already involved with UEFA through the UEFA Women's Football Committee, and it seems a logical step, really, to put myself up for election. I mean, it's going to be a tough battle, we all know that, but I think my credentials speak for themselves. I'm a former player, I'm a former captain, I'm a professor of governance, I've worked around diversity in sport. So I hope that some of that chimes with the zeitgeist in football at the moment. And if it does, then I'll get elected. And if it doesn't, I won't. It's as simple as that.
We spoke this week, and you got some interesting ideas. I think you were talking about a few discrepancies and how the women's game is treated at FIFA around this awarding of the World Cup, and in terms of the payments received by the teams in the World Cup. Could you expand a bit on your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, in fairness to FIFA, a lot of the change is already underway for the next FIFA Women's World Cup in 2023, which of course is going to the joint bid of Australia and New Zealand. I think that would be a fabulous tournament, by the way. And what I was mentioning was, the need to first of all expand the tournament, which again is underway for that event. But also, when it comes to judging future Women's World Cup bids, I think it's really important that they have the same process as the Men's World Cup bid, so that it's the member associations of FIFA that do the assessment and decision, rather than simply the FIFA Congress. Because, in many respects, it's the member associations that are closest to understanding the viability of a bid and so on. And it seems to me odd that there is a separate mechanism for the women's bid decision to the men's bid decision. And the other point I mentioned to Martin this week was just about the decoupling of the commercial and sponsorship rights to the Women's World Cup from the men's. I think we're now in a position in terms of the global world game at elite level, certainly at FIFA Women's World Cup level, where I think we've got a really important, attractive product to sell, particularly in these difficult times. And I think there could be advantages to the women's game from decoupling.
One of the things that strikes me is the fact that obviously it's only about 150 of the 211 FAs that actually have a women's team, I think. So how do you overcome, particularly if you have a vote on the World Cup taken by the entire FIFA Congress, the fact that some of those FAs voting might not actually have women's teams?
Yeah, it's a good point, Rob, and I think it underlines, how much more work we've still got to do in the women's game. If you just step back a little bit, there are some tremendous figures, about the percentage growth we've seen in women's football in Europe. It's growing 4 times faster than the men's game and the boys' game. And I think that's wonderful. 3.5 million people watched the UEFA Women's Champions League last summer. But, and this is the big but, although we should congratulate ourselves for how far we've come in the women's game, I think all of us who've been around for some time and know the game inside out realise that there's still a heck of a way to go as well. And you've highlighted it there. There are still countries where there is no real infrastructure of women's football, and that's quite a chunk of countries, as you mentioned. So what we're going to need to do at FIFA level really is think strategically about how we kickstart women's football a bit more effectively in those countries, and how we encourage and incentivize them to develop a national team. Because there's different schools of thought about that. Do you just go straight in with a national team and enter a competition? By the way, that was my experience with Wales, back in the late 90s. Thankfully, the Welsh FA decided to kind of embrace the international team. But, you're on the end of a few hammerings then, for obvious reasons, because you don't have a development structure or pathway to bring your players through. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is you hold back until you have a elite pathway. And you invest heavily in the sort of younger ages, maybe between 8 and 12, and delay your launch of a full side, working on the 17s and 19s age groups and so on. Whichever you choose, it's important that women's football is given a proper leg up here.
Obviously, with your position at UEFA, we've got the Euros that have been delayed now until 2022. How do you think preparations are looking for that tournament in England? And one of the things that's often come up is the fact Wembley's only being used for the final. Do you think an upsurge of interest and yearning for fans to get back into stadiums could see a big uplift in sales for tickets for that tournament, and there could be an even bigger demand because fans have been kept out of football just so long, and maybe there might be more of a demand to use the bigger stadiums as well?
Well, let's hope so, because as you say, the timing was out of our control for obvious reasons, but it might work quite well for us in the sense that 2022, might be the optimum time to hold a major event. I think in any case, the sales will be good, to be perfectly honest. I mean, you couldn't choose a better country than England to host a women's Euros at the moment, quite frankly. The WSL is thriving. The game is really growing there, grassroots and elite level, but particularly elite level. Using Old Trafford for the opening game is significant, obviously, and obviously the other really important major stadiums in England. I mean, obviously disappointing from our point of view that we came so close to qualifying and then didn't, because, for us in Wales, it would have been a real game changer to qualify for not just a Euros, but a major Euros, where I think the public appetite will be enormous, and all credit to the English FA for, putting their backs into it, because I think this will be a real game changer in terms of the profile and vision of the women's game. I see no reason at all, by the way, why the stadia can't sell out. I think there's a real appetite for watching top quality women's football, and I think that will be demonstrated next year in England.
I think you got a picture of Tommy Smith in the background there, the famous 1968 fist in the air. Is it what's the story behind that?
Yeah, that's one of my favourite. Well, there's no story other than I like iconic sports prints. Really, I mean, if I shuffled around the room, I'll show you my other one. I've got the Muhammad Ali Maradona one, and I've got the George Best classic ones, and I've got the 1958 Wales team in the Swedish World Cup. So yeah, I mean, I'm a proper sports anorak. I grew up in a sports mad house. My father's absolutely sports bonkers. So we've always been interested in all sports, really. So yeah, no, nothing more than that, really. I just love the iconic sports pictures.
Well, Laura, thanks for joining us. Great to have you as the first guest on the Sport Unlocked pod, and good luck with the rest of the campaigning.
We'll no doubt catch up soon along the campaign path.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
And that brings a close to another episode of Sport Unlocked, the podcast taking you inside the sports news stories. Martin, Tarek, thanks for your company yet again, and thank you to everyone for listening. If you're enjoying the pod, be really grateful if you could rate, review and subscribe to Sport Unlocked on whichever platform you get your pods from. And most importantly, enjoy the sports viewing in the days ahead, and we'll hopefully speak soon. Goodbye for now.